Well, hey, welcome back to the After Amen podcast. Thank you for sticking with us for episode 3. We are so glad to have you, Creekside family. We are going to be jumping into a conversation about creation, and I got with me Pastor David and Alex on the mixer, making sure we sound all nice and lovely here in these mics. So, Pastor David, I have a very important question for you to kick off this podcast. Did Adam and Eve have belly buttons?
Well, thank you for having me on, Jake, and also thank you for the little kazoo sound that you just did a little minute ago that was edited out of this podcast. Did Adam and Eve have belly buttons? I'm going to say for the sake of, what's the word? I'm going to say for the sake of functionality, that Adam and Eve had no need for a belly button, and obviously they were not in the womb, so I'm going to say no. No, they did not have belly buttons, and that's something that I will probably, I'll take to the grave. So,
okay, for the sake of argument and diversity of opinion, I will take the yes, Adam and Eve did have belly buttons, and my argument is that God cares about aesthetics. He wanted to create evidence. He rested on the seventh day, even though he didn't need to. So he created a belly button, even though he didn't need to. So,
and what purpose did it serve other than just looking?
Yeah, just needed to
for
be
the
there.
Aesthetics.
Just needed to be there because God said it was good, and
okay,
He wanted it to be there.
God wanted there to be a belly button. Now, I guess the question is when Adam and Eve are depicted in like Da Vinci's Da Vinci's Garden of Eden, like the Adam, like does he have a belly button there?
Ooh, that's a great question. I don't know.
Can we pull that up? Can somebody pull up and also what is the actual name of that? Yeah, I believe it's in the 16th chapel, right? Yeah, so somebody look that up. Did Adam and Eve have a belly button in the 16th chapel? They did. He is depicted with a belly button, and
there we go.
Well, there's a lot of other things that are wrong with that anyway.
Yeah, we should trust Da Vinci because he is, the final word.
And what is the actual name of that? What is the actual name of that painting? The Creation of Adam. That's it. That's the one I'm looking for. Yeah, well, I disagree with Da Vinci, and I disagree with you. I don't think there was any purpose to that. So, yeah. Well, thank you all for coming back, and thank you for indulging us on very important matters like that. Mm-hmm. But in definite contrast to that, we know that creation does matter. Creation matters, and the doctrine of creation matters a great deal. First and foremost, because it teaches us about God. Genesis 1 and 2 teach us so much about God, and we've spoken to that over the last couple of weeks. We learn about God's eternality. We learn about God's omniscience, His omnipotence. We learn, a lot of those different things from Genesis 1 and 2, but it also leads us into many other different doctrines that we're going to be getting into in the next couple of weeks. And so, as much as we like to compartmentalize the doctrine of creation, if we were to think about it systematically, it plays into a lot of the other themes of doctrine that we're going to see, I think, over the next 4 weeks. And so very important. And Jake, if you'll remember, this past Sunday, we landed on 3 primary things about creation. Not that those are the only things about creation that are important, but 3 things that I wanted to point out. And that was, number 1, that in the beginning, God created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. The second one being that God created man and woman in the image of God, in His image and likeness. And we unpacked that. And then the last thing that we unpacked was that God created us for worship. And that goes back to Genesis 2:15, that Adam was planted in the garden to work it and to keep it. But we understand that is more than just an agricultural meaning, that he's not out there just doing yard work, but that it is a direct indication of Adam's worship and obedience to God. So with a couple of those things in mind, as you've been thinking about doctrine of creation last couple of days, and maybe some of the things that jumped out to you from the sermon. What has landed with you?
As we were sort of talking, I kind of walked away with two key takeaways. One, I loved how you opened in the beginning with just this reminder that as we read through the Bible and think through this doctrine of creation, it should be a means that leads us to adoration of God. It should lead us into worship, not to silly philosophies. I think even Paul talks about that later on in the Bible, that we shouldn't be led to philosophies or worthless thinking, but we could be led into adoration of this creator who did create. And the second was your main application. So simple, just to get outside and to enjoy creation, even though you made a dig to my fellow West Coasters about being tree huggers, which I will proudly rep. But
do y'all really hug trees out there?
Yeah, all of them.
Okay.
No. No, but
I can see maybe the sequoias.
Yeah, but those are big trees. You can't really hug them.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so
you could try.
We try, but sort of thinking through what does it look like to enjoy creation, and I made the bold decision, especially at this time in Charleston, to step outside and to water some bushes that were in front of my house, and as I was watering them, to remember that God created everything with order and intention and creativity, and they're beautifully made. And we braved the pollen, and I regret it now, but it was a good exercise to just think on God and celebrate Him.
That's good, and I appreciate that. And personally, that stems from a major pet peeve, I guess, that I have. And growing up in the Christian world, we see Genesis 1 and 2 in the account of all that God creates and how, he orders the creation, and we see the finished product of it. And I understand that there's a deep fascination, and we have people that want to understand how things work. But you think about the process of any job that's ever done, like we don't spend near as much time talking about the process and order of steps. And take, for example, a cabinet that's being made, by a carpenter. We don't spend a whole lot of time, devolving into the process of the carpenter, but we enjoy the carpenter's work. And we sit back and we enjoy the finished product, and we see the design and the craftsmanship of the carpenter, and we think, man, well, he is just an incredibly talented carpenter. But whenever it comes to creation, instead of enjoying it or marveling at the craftsmanship and the intelligence of the creator, we spend a whole lot more time talking about the process of that. And I think sometimes that's really good and it's helpful, and we want to understand and ask those questions, but we're missing the point. And so anyway, I just felt like that was important to note, and wanted to include that in the sermon. And man, you guys did a phenomenal job of sending in questions for creation, and maybe even case to my point. There's so many questions about creation. I think that this is on a lot of people's minds, and so today, instead of rehashing a lot of what we have, time that we've spent talking about creation, we're just going to jump right in. Maybe answer some of the questions that we have and do the very best that we can in answering them. And so with that being said, Jake, you want to take a look at some of these questions, and we can try and unpack a few of these?
Yeah. We have a first question of why did God even create in the first place? And I think that's a really thoughtful question. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. Why did God create? I'm going to start by reasons that God did not create, and reasons that often get spewed within the church circles, and well-intentioned and well-meaning, however, probably untrue. And a lot of times I've heard in the church, well, God created because he needed someone to love. God created because he needed something to do, and I'm going to use a word here. It's a theological term called the aseity of God, or God's aseity, which basically means that God needs nothing. And I would even, I would translate that to be as far as a relationship with us. Now, does God want a relationship with us? Yes, absolutely. But did God need it, as if somehow he was going to be crushed or devastated or incomplete or unfulfilled or unsatisfied if he didn't have that? No, God needs nothing. However, as we look to the scriptures and we see what the Bible has to say about the doctrine of creation, we see over and over and over again that God creates for his glory. Like, he wants us to know him, and he wants to be known in this way. And so what he does is he creates again for his glory, so that we can be able to see creation and ultimately know that there is a creator, and that he is to be worshiped and enjoyed and appreciated. So,
Yeah, man, I love going through this series, because I know many of our listeners and many of our congregation would probably agree with this. It has made me appreciate what the Bible teaches even more, because I think of what you just said, that God doesn't need us, but he wants us. That drives me further into like his heart. Not just this God who created me out of a need to be achieving or to be doing or to be a warrior for his kingdom, but God just wants to be with me and to have me delight in him, and he delight in me as I grow more into the image of his son, formed by his Holy Spirit, moving and working in my life. Like, what a comforting idea that God made me because he wants to know me and love me.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to the next several pieces of doctrine that we're going to look at, we're going to see this coming week about how we sinned against God, and that sort of diminished, if not entirely erased, our possibility of knowing God. And that's why he especially has revealed himself. And then we're going to look at the doctrine of redemption and the doctrine of God's pursuit of his people and coming to die on the cross and resurrecting. But all of this starts with this desire that God has to have us know him and to give him proper glory. And so, yeah, absolutely. That, I believe God created us for his glory.
Yeah, that's awesome. God's aseity. What a good theological term. What about, as we're looking at creation, man, I love that you opened us up on Sunday talking about flat earth, old earth, young earth, even middle earth. I mean, come on.
Did you get that reference?
Yeah, I saw that. Giving us some Frodo up in here.
Yeah, I'd love for there to be a challenge, like just every week, to see if I can slide in a Lord of the Rings quote or something every week. We'll see.
I think the challenge should be for our congregation to see who can catch it.
To see who can catch it.
Man, I think that'd be fun.
People are already starting to call out nerd whenever I use Lord of the Rings.
I heard that and I appreciated it.
I might need to chill out a little bit.
It was actually me. I called it out. So.
It was you.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Oh, I think for you it's the Lord of the Rings references, and for me it's the Star Wars references. So
it's crazy. Like, I didn't even grow up with being this huge fan of Lord of the Rings. It just it kind of happened like the last number of years. There's so many good references there.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, I did bring up a good point, and there are some contentious debates around the Earth's age. And I just want to say that first and foremost, I think a number of people have made this to be a first tier issue, that we absolutely have to believe in one theory or the other. And I'm going to unpack some of that. So there's several different schools of thought about the age of the Earth. I'm going to unpack just two, and these would probably be the two most well-known within the Christian circles. And that's young Earth and old Earth. And young Earth basically states, they would argue that the age of the Earth is young, probably somewhere within a 6,000-year-old range, 6 to 10 or something like that, and that the days of the earth God's creation of the earth were a literal 6 days that God created, day 1, day 2, and so on, and that on the seventh day God rested. And the scriptures, say that in Genesis 1 and 2 that's what God did. Genesis 1 and 2 say that God created in 6 days, and on the seventh day He rested. So young Earth would support that position. Old Earth would say that the Earth is actually hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old, and they would use scientific evidence to support the age of the Earth as being much older than what young Earth would say. I mean, by leaps and bounds. And they would also sort of transition to say that in Genesis 1 that the days were not literal days. This is how they have justified this position. They said, well, yes, it was still God who created, yet He did not create in a literal day, but that this process of creation took place over a number of years, hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is what it states. And, and then they would use Bible verses to support this idea, like a day to us is like, or 1,000 days to us is like a day to the Lord. And I think that at the heart of both of these positions is, one, trying to honor the text. They're both trying to honor a position that says this is what God did and this is how God created. And I think at the same time, each is trying to honor trying to honor the Lord in their position. The young Earth folks would argue that scientifically the Earth may look older, but the reason that the Earth looks older is only because of the flood. And then the flood that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 6 sort of washed away at much of the earth, and now it has the appearance of looking old, but it's actually not that old. And so that's some of the contention, that's some of the debate between the young and old earth. And again, those are not the only two positions as to how old the earth is, but there's many. But that seems to be the one that comes up again and again within Christian circles.
Yeah, and I love that you point out that it's done by groups of people who are trying to give honor to the Lord and to the text in both senses. And we've said time and time again over this series, the goal for this series is to talk about first tier issues. Yeah. And so where we need to hold a closed hand and say this is definite, we need to agree on the triune nature of the God we worship. Well, we're gonna hold to that. Yeah. Where we need to hold to the fact that creation was made for God and for His glory, and we're made in His image and for His worship. Mm-hmm. We're gonna hold tight to that. Yeah. And we can hold loosely these ideas of, okay, maybe it's old earth or young earth, because we hold tightly to Christ and Christ crucified at the end of the day. Yep. And so,
we can still be friends. I mean, we can still go to church together, and
we can disagree on their belly buttons. And
yeah, I mean, and I think absolutely, there's many places where we need to draw the line in the sand. This is not one of them. And again, I think on both sides, especially on the young earth, there is this desire to maintain the purity of the language, like day one, literal. And I think that the hope in doing that is, I guess the fear in not seeing it as literal is that, well, if we don't take this as literal, then there are other places in the Bible that we won't or can't take literally as well. And so I think that there's a fear of compromising in other places of Scripture. And so again, the desire is to maintain like this purity of literal day, so that in other places it won't be compromised.
Yeah. And I think that leads pretty well into our next question, looking at those two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, and even really looking at Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2, we can get some different readings. And what I love about this is that there have been people who are way smarter than me who come up with different readings, and we can agree and we can even agree to disagree on some of these. And so one view of Genesis 1:1 that I was taught was especially looking at the Hebrew. There is a particular word order in Hebrew that would sort of clue you in that this is maybe a sort of a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away sort of opening sequence, or maybe an introduction to the story that's about to be told. And so that's the way that Genesis 1 verse 1 is written. And the first action we actually see is in Genesis 1 verse 3, when God speaks and says, "Let there be light." And this sort of uh, walks around giving the genealogy or the story of how God creates the heavens and the earth. And it also creates this really fun reading of Genesis 1:1, because we get this this form of these two words, tohu vavohu, or formless and void. What I love about this, and I will say this to anyone who cares to listen about Genesis 1:1 in Hebrew, is it is a group of words that is not used anywhere else. So it's really hard to translate. But when we do find it, it's sort of like in English saying the world was all willy-nilly. It's sort of an empty phrase, but formless and void is sort of a category for how God begins to create. And you mentioned another way that we could read Genesis 1:1. Would you mind speaking to that?
Yeah, I mean, and just to give context to why this matters, or to what the purpose of it is, we recognize that God created out of nothing, right? And so this idea of ex nihilo, that God is creating the contents or the ingredients as He is creating the full picture, and it was brought into question just because of, I don't know, say necessarily brought into question, but trying to discern that idea of ex nihilo, and then Genesis 1:2 says that the Spirit is hovering over the waters, and it's like, okay, well, what waters? Is this being does this mean that there was the existence of water before God created? And so I think one point of view is just like you mentioned, that is just like a beginning, that Genesis 1 and 2 is sort of like almost like the title of a chapter. Like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes into this detailed explanation for how God created. And so that's one point of view. And the other point of view, again, among many, we just don't have time to unpack all of these, is that Genesis 1:1 means just that. Like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then everything else goes into this detailed explanation of God completing what is happening in Genesis 1:1. So he creates the heavens and the earth, and then basically in 3 through, I don't know, the rest of the end of the chapter is this completion, or this finalizing of all the things that God created in Genesis 1:1. And so again, the two different ways of looking at it. Okay, so in the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:1 means like it's a title for what's about to happen, is this general overviewing of things. And then there's this other point of view that says, no, this is literally God is creating the heavens and the earth, and then the rest is like a completion of it.
Yeah, and he brings from chaos into order. He brings, as I said, formless and void. God gives form to creation. I mean, even look at Genesis, days 1 through 3, and you see this God who's bringing form to creation. He is bringing light. He's moving the waters. He's bringing the dry land out. And then it also says that creation is void. and days 4 through 6, he's bringing people and things to populate this creation. And so he creates plants and he creates animals and fish and sea creatures and things that are flying in the air. And then he creates mankind and gives things to live in this creation and to enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the next questions that we see is is Genesis 1 through 3 to be taken literally? Which I think is a great question. Is Genesis 1 through 3 to be taken literally? And now I'm going to answer yes, almost emphatically yes, that Genesis 1 through 3 is to be taken literally. And I want to come to two reasonings that we can believe that this is to be taken literally. First of which is the historical figure of Adam is referenced in the scriptures. And so Adam in this way is, I guess, if you were to go that route, that Genesis 1 through 3 is not to be taken literally, but it is meant more as a figurative language to describe us as humanity, then basically what that would mean to say is that we as humanity, like we devolved into sin, that type of thing. But historically speaking, even if you were to look at the genealogy of Jesus, it traces it all the way back to Adam. Matthew's version of this genealogy traces it all the way back to Abraham. For someone who was, Jewish like Matthew, that was important. He's, his context, he's reaching a more Jewish audience. And so that genealogy traces back to Abraham. Luke, on the other hand, whom I believe was reaching a more broad audience, he traces it not back to Abraham, but back to Adam, to say that Jesus is not just the Savior of the Jews, but that Jesus is the Savior of all, right? And so we see in in Luke chapter 3, as we're tracing back this genealogy to Adam, it says that he, talking about the son of Canaan, the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. So if Jesus seems to support this idea of a literal Adam. But then there's also the theological element to this that makes this very important. And this is sort of summarized in Adam's federal headship over creation, or basically that Adam is our representative in the garden. Like a lot of times we ask the question, okay, so if I was in the garden, would I have sinned and would I have done what Adam did? And the answer is absolutely, because we do it all the time, right? And so in the beginning, Adam acts as this representative for humanity who sins in the garden. And whenever he sins, ultimately, we know that this brings death. So he's introduced sin to us as humans. He's also introduced death to us as humans. And I'm going to support this coming to us out of Romans chapter 5. It says, therefore, in verse 12, just as sin came into the world through one man, this being Adam, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned. It says, for sin indeed was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. So it's basically Paul saying that Adam was there, he sinned, death came to all humanity because of that, but Christ has come as the second Adam who faced the same temptation, right, but did not sin, and ultimately died, but came back to life and resurrected, and now he stands as this second Adam who has come to redeem us and who now has gone before us in resurrection. And so for those two reasons, historically and theologically, it's important to maintain that Genesis 1 through 3 is to be taken literally. And one other point in that is that this is where we also get what is referred to as the proto-evangelion in Genesis chapter 3.
Ooh, come on.
Proto-evangelion, which means that it is the first appearance of the gospel message, right? As God is giving out consequences for the fall, it gives out to man that thorns and thistles, that work's going to be hard, and which is so telling, right? I've never met a man in my entire life. I've never met a man who at some point in his life did not hate his job or have questions about his job or be frustrated with his job. I've never met a man whose whole life experience is perplexed because of his job. Never met a man in my entire life who at some point wasn't frustrated. On the other hand, as God's given out consequences to Eve for her sin, says that you're going to face pains in childbearing. And when we know that this is not just the literal labor pains, that's a very temporal thing. I mean, that's, if you're lucky, hopefully that lasts, 24 hours or less, that labor pain. But this is talking about the process of how of a woman raising and rearing a child and getting them ready. And I've seen, again, a number of ladies who their constant source of struggle and anxiety is her children. It is because, again, we've been wired to think this way. We've been wired to care this way. And so this is where tensions for 9 out of 10 families come from. Man struggling with his work, frustrated with his work, ladies frustrated with their kids, and they're coming together around that. And so we see those pieces as consequences, but then thankfully God reveals this message, or what is known as the proto-evangelion, where he says, there is one who is coming into the world to crush the head of the serpent. And this is a foreshadowing of the offspring of the woman, who is Christ Jesus, who we know who has crushed the head of the serpent. So yeah, I mean, Genesis 1 through 3 definitely has to be real.
So you're saying I woke up sore this morning because of sin?
Well,
because of some fruit?
Well, yeah. If death comes from sin, then certainly all the symptoms of death, like getting old and having the sniffles and all the other things that we experience, they're symptoms of sin, right? And that's why we long for this new creation where we'll have new bodies, and it's going to be good.
Yeah, I think in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul writes, "In this tent we groan," and I feel that. I feel that on a physical.
Yeah, yeah,
absolutely. Well, we got a few more questions. Talking a little bit about how God relates to creation and God's character in creation. We've said a couple times throughout this podcast that God created in 6 days, and there's a 7-day creation narrative. On that last day, God is resting. What does rest tell us about God's character, and is God still resting? What do you think?
That's a great question. I think so. Yeah, God rests on the Sabbath day, calls it holy, right? I think one that points to the perfection of creation. 7 in the Bible is the number of completion, right? It's God's number. So God is complete. Creation, God has completed creation. Creation is complete, and it is good, right? So it's perfect. So I think it sort of signifies that there's nothing about creation at that point that needed to be more perfect, because it is as good as it needed to be. It is in a flourishing state. But I also think, more importantly, that God is demonstrating for us the relationship that we should have with him, and the work-life balance, that there is this whole other day, this 7th day, of which we need to rest and take time to slow down and recognize our Creator and recognize that we are finite individuals and our capacity to be able to work and accomplish. Like, we're not God. God could have gone on creating. We need rest. Like, literally, we need rest. And so I think God did that to demonstrate not just that we need rest, but how we rest. We rest, we Sabbath, we honor Him, we reflect on our limitations. We trust that God will do more with our rest by faith. We trust that God will do more with our rest than we could ever possibly imagine by another day of working. So is God still resting? I would say it's an interesting question from the sense, like, is God still resting from the work of creation? Well, I don't know that He's adding on to creation right now. We know that Jesus says that He's gone on to prepare a place for us in heaven, which sort of indicates that there is like there's plans like for each one of us as individuals that Jesus is working on in heaven. But does that mean that God is not at all working in His creation today? I think we've answered that in the last couple of weeks, that God's very much interactive and very much doing things with His creation. He's revealing Himself, through the Scriptures. The Holy Spirit is constantly, doing things in and through our lives. And so, it just depends on what the question means. Is God still resting, like, from His creation? Well, yes, but from us as humanity, like doing things, no.
Yeah. He's still very much active. He's very much moving towards us in love. And I love even this idea of God resting on the seventh day and showing to us that He can do more with what He calls us to do than what we could ever do if we were trying to do it on our own. We would run hard. We would try our best. We would maybe do good for a little bit, but eventually we're going to burn out and we're going to fall flat on our face. I imagine like life, just a treadmill that's going just a little bit too fast. We would try hard, do good, and then fall flat. Mm-hmm. Whereas the offer on the table for those who confess with their mouth and believe with their heart that Jesus Christ is Lord is that He can do far more with the time that we give Him, the resources that we give Him. I mean, He even said us that in the tithes and offerings given for in the Old Testament, right? And we can see that as when we give back to God, He doesn't work on our heart. The things that He gives us shows us where our heart is, and ultimately shows us that our ultimate loyalty should be to Him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see from the beginning that God created us to work, right? Like, God created us to work. And so I think we need to be people who are working. We need to be people who are creative, and we need to be people who are productive members of society in whatever form or facet that God's called us, whether that be in the secular sphere, whether that be, at home, raising our children. The Lord has called us to be a people who work. And I think, I saw this interesting quote the other day that you have to burn a little before you can burn out. So we need to be a people who are working, but we also need to be a people who practice rest, and that comes through the Sabbath, where we honor God and focus on God.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it says, I think in 1 Corinthians, whether you eat or sleep, whatever you do, do it all to the glory of God. And that goes back to your last point that you encouraged us with, that we are created for worship. Yeah. So as we enjoy creation this week, as we enjoy it for the weeks to come, would it be a means that leads us to delight in our Father who made us and delights in the things He made and doesn't need us but wants us? Yeah. And what good news is that?
Man, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think, we live in one of the most unique places in all of the world, in Charleston. And we certainly don't, we don't often think about it that way, but this is one of the number one tourist destinations in all the world. It seems to be one of the like fastest growing cities in America. And man, we have all this at our fingertips within a 30-minute driving distance. And so, yeah, again, like let's go find a way to enjoy God's creation. And I'll be honest in saying that I haven't made time for that yet, but I'm looking forward to just sitting and relaxing and enjoying the handiwork of the Lord, and letting that point me back to the Creator. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just a couple of resources that have been really helpful in my understanding of this. There's a book by one of my old theology professors. It's called 40 Questions About Creation and Evolution. That is by Dr. Kenneth Keatley and Mark Rooker. It's a part of a series of 40 questions. And man, they, not going to tell you what to think, but just present all of the different arguments. And then the other is the Theology for the Church. That was by Dr. Danny Aiken. Two fantastic resources. And so if you're looking to dive deeper into that, those would be some fantastic resources for you. Jake closes out by telling us what we can look forward to this coming week, and how folks could maybe generate even more interest and excitement around the podcast.
Yeah, well, we're super grateful for y'all joining us on the podcast, and looking forward to the weeks ahead as we continue on in our doctrine series. We're going to be jumping into the exciting topic of sin. Oh, aren't we so excited to talk about sin? Come on, y'all.
Yeah. Just like somebody said earlier, look to your left, look to your right, look at the mirror. There's sin.
Yep. Yeah. So as we teach in kids ministry, we're going to be talking about when we think, say, or do anything that goes against God or His commands. And so we're super excited to talk about it. We all know it. We all experience it. But what do we do with it? And what does it teach us about our good God? And so if you all have questions, we would love to hear what your thoughts are or questions are about sin. So you can drop a question in our Got Questions form. And you'll see that at the end of the sermon that we have not done a super great job of putting up, but we will do better. We'll make sure it gets up this week. And so you can scan that QR code at the end of the sermon on Sunday and let us know your questions. But we're so grateful for y'all joining us and spending time with us. Thank you for letting us be a part of your commute or your time of working out, or wherever you find us joining you this awesome day. But hey, just a reminder, go get outside, go hug a tree, and remember that God created it for His glory and for your good.